Goff.
Mr Chairman, I'd like first just to pick up a couple of points that the Chair of the Committee, Mark Mitchell, made, and he said that the guidelines for what constituted terrorist activity was clearly set out under Section 5 of the Terrorism Suppression Act 2002. I have to confess to have had some involvement with that Act, and I don't think that we did set it out anywhere near as clearly as it needs to. And that is because a terrorist act, for example, if I just give one example under 5(2)(b, defines it as the act falls under this subsection if a group tries to unduly compel or force a government or any international organisation to do or abstain from doing any act. And I guess if I was going to fight alongside my family in Aleppo to stop President Bashar al-Assad from bombing my family's home and slaughtering the people, I would come under the definition of terrorist. Unless, and maybe the Minister can give me some comfort in this, it is defined as a situation that occurs in a situation of armed conflict. So I think we do need some clarity around that. I'm personally not satisfied with the contemporary relevance of that definition. I don't think it's anywhere near tight enough, which is why, if we can't do it in this bill, I'd like the Minister to look at it in terms of the review of the legislation next year. The second thing in relation to Mark Mitchell's point, he raised the question, do we want to encourage Kiwis to go and participate in a conflict? And I suppose my answer would be the same as the members. No, I wouldn't actually want to encourage my kids or my nephews or anybody else to go and fight in that sort of armed conflict. But that's the wrong question. The question is, should we take to ourselves as a government the right to prevent them from going to do that? And that's a much more difficult question. And the answer that I give to that question is no, unless. So generally yes, but no unless it is a terrorist activity. I want to pick up the key reason why actually Labor is now supporting this legislation, and that is the changes that have been made under visual surveillance and the emergency warrantless surveillance that this Act allows. When this bill came into the House, Mr Chairman, the definition, the scope for what the SIS could do with these two powers, visual surveillance, which is incredibly intrusive. My colleague said it could be, you know, a camera in the lounge or the living room, or it could be the bathroom or the bedroom as well. It could pick up people that are independent of those that you might want to surveil. You know, I wouldn't want a camera in my house, and nor would you, sir. And so you need to be very careful about how you would give that power. And under the bill as introduced, as the Law Commission pointed out, the threshold for visual surveillance, translating what already exists under the Search and Surveillance Act for police, translating it to the SIS would, and I quote there, impose too low a threshold for the authorisation of visual surveillance. The threshold for visual surveillance is substantially lower than that which applies to the police under the Search and Surveillance Act. So we were faced with not equalising a power for the police and the SIS, but giving a power to the SIS which had to meet a much lower threshold. And that clearly was never going to be acceptable to us. What the solution was, in fact, in this bill was to take out the low threshold which was authorised for the detection of activities prejudicial to security. Well, that's that wide, sir. And for the purpose of gathering foreign intelligence information that's essential for security, equally wide. And we've translated it to just look at the scope of a terrorist act or facilitation of a terrorist act. So we've brought that scope for visual surveillance right down to what this bill is apparently about, given the explanatory note on the introductory copy of the bill. Likewise, we've required that the Director of the SIS must provide a copy of the visual surveillance warrant to the Inspector General. That's new. So we're bringing the Inspector General in to have scrutiny and surveillance over the SIS's visual surveillance. And if I was to make another comment to the Minister, I would say that an important part of the review that's coming up would be to increase the independence and powers of the Inspector General. I think for the first time we're seeing an Inspector General that actually can act independently, Mr Chair.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Yet when we received a briefing from the Inspector General, she said her role was to advise the Minister, which it is, but we would like to have it made absolutely clear that the Inspector General sits over here and independently makes sure that the Minister and the Commissioner and the Director of the SIS are all doing their job under the law and not in breach of the law. And the other thing that we did, and nobody's mentioned it in the debate so far, we've increased the penalty for knowingly failing to comply with this section of the Act from a $1,000 to a $10,000 fine. I think that's really important. I guess my even bigger worry was the concept of having warrantless surveillance. One of the things that you can take some comfort on is that before the SIS intrudes into your life with surveillance, at the moment by means other than visual surveillance, there needed to be a warrant. And that warrant had to be agreed to in a domestic case by the Commissioner of Security Warrants, who's a High Court judge. But again, we had a situation where under the bill as introduced, this power of warrantless surveillance was going to come in with a much, much lower threshold. The Law Society again said that, the police, when they use a warrantless emergency surveillance situation, it's to follow up any type of serious offence punishable by a term of imprisonment of 14 years or more. So when the police exercise it, they have to meet a whole series of prerequisites, but it also has to be for the most serious form of crime. And as the Law Society pointed out, when you gave it to the SIS, neither the commission of an offence nor a risk of life or safety feature in the proposed SIS emergency surveillance provisions. By contrast, the only element relating to establishing urgency and emergency is that the delay must be likely to result in a loss of intelligence. That would have been ludicrous. You would have been giving incredibly intrusive and powers not subject to the normal controls to the SIS for a very, very low threshold. So once again, we have narrowed that to simply looking at a terrorist act or facilitating a terrorist act. That is the critical change that has been made in this legislation, sir. We've also cut down the hours from 48 to 24, and that's quite important. And again, at each point, we've given direct power to the Inspector General, who once, in the original bill, there had to be an agreement to pass it to the Inspector General in some parts. Now the Inspector General automatically has the power of oversight. I think those changes are really important. They are the difference between not being able to support the bill and supporting it. The other thing is that these powers are meant to be used incredibly rarely. And how do we know that they will be? Because the director is required now to report. Not annually, because if you report annually it can be 18 months after the event, but every 6 months. And to bring down to the actual time bands the period of time that the authorisation was in place. I think those are important. I hope, Minister, they are carried over into the review, because while I'm assured by you that you want a consensus-style approach to this, I picked up a comment by the Prime Minister that said, well, we haven't got these powers, but we can broaden the powers after the review. Well, that smacked of incredible arrogance, I've got to say, Mr Chairman, and I'm worried about that. I hope that we can do the sort of exercise that we all did on the Select Committee, look at it properly, work out what is necessary for the protection of New Zealanders, both their safety and their right to privacy and their other rights. Can I, as a final point, Mr Chairman, ask the Minister to consider the SOP 42 that my colleague Kennedy Graham has put before the House, because on a first reading of it, it seems to me to be reasonable. It talks about meeting our obligations under 2178. It talks about ensuring that we remain consistent with our obligations under international human rights law. I can't see any problem with those two things. And it defines a foreign terrorist fighter. So I would be interested in the Minister's response to what I believe is a very genuine effort on the part of Dr. Kennedy Graham to bring the definition down to something with greater clarity and with greater certainty. So if the Minister could reply to that point when he takes the call.